Breaking My Silence by Marvin Sussman. We now ask that you turn off cell phones and any other devices that may interrupt tonight's performance. So that all may enjoy the show and no one's view is blocked, please refrain from video and still photography. We wish to thank Filament Theater for their help in mounting this production, and we like to thank the National Veterans Art Museum for their encouragement and cooperation, and also for the important work that is their mission. And now, please welcome Marvin Sussman.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start off with a joke. The Irish poet Oscar Wilde once insulted a speaker by comparing him to a dog walking on his two hind legs. He said that you had to applaud the dog, not because he was doing it well, but just because he was doing it. So you're going to have to judge whether this old dog can really walk. So let's get started then. Well, the first storyteller we know about was Homer, and his first story was the Iliad, the Trojan War, a war story. So war stories go back to the very beginning of literature, over 3,000 years. Everyone wants to hear a war story, but war veterans don't like to tell war stories. So why stir up unpleasant memories? Who wants to do that? And even if a veteran wanted to tell a war story, how is it even possible? Who can really describe the horrors of war? Certainly not the vast majority of veterans. I've been reading all my life. But writing is an entirely different matter. So why am I telling these stories? Since my war experience, I have watched other Americans go to war, several wars, none of which were defensive wars, and all of which were controversial, to say the least. I believe that few politicians understand much about either armed force or diplomacy. So, in their ignorance, they find it safer to use armed force than to expose their own incompetence at diplomacy. By the public's assent or by its silence, soldiers were much too easily, and are still too easily, sent overseas to kill and to die. I wrote these stories to explain to the public what combat demands from the soldier, hoping that the public's knowledge will somehow make it more difficult for our leaders to send soldiers overseas to kill and to die. So let's begin with a story that I always consider to be funny. The thing is, German soldiers were permitted to surrender only when they ran out of ammunition, and on that July day in Normandy, they were trapped and starving and wanted to surrender and were getting rid of their ammunition by dumping it on us. Burp guns, machine guns, mortars, 88s. And we, the dumped upon, Troop A of the 4th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, were crouching in foxholes dug into hedgerows, pasture walls of solid earth, a meter thick and 2 meters high with trees growing out of them. And we were answering their fire by calling down an artillery barrage on their hedgerows. And there was a light drizzle that was Mother Nature's pox on both our houses. The date was D+37, July 13th, 1944. From Utah Beach, the 7th Army Corps had cut across the peninsula, trapping German troops against the sea. Cut off from supplies, the Krauts were running on empty stomachs and would get their next meal in a prisoner of war camp. And the sooner they ran out of ammo, the better for us. Since D-Day, A Troop had lost 7 dead and 22 wounded out of 140 men at full strength. But advancing toward the end of the peninsula, our mood was good because With the war going our way, we could think seriously about going home. Now, if you're wondering why cavalry troopers were crouching in foxholes, so was I, because I enlisted in the cavalry to avoid being drafted into the infantry. Nobody told me that when the cavalry dismounts, it becomes infantry. So, of course, we teenagers knew nothing about the service. Pearl Harbor was attacked less than 6 months after my high school graduation, and during 1942, I had to choose a branch of service or else be drafted during 1943. So, as autumn leaves were falling, I raised my right hand and took one step forward into the cavalry, which was just then trading in its horses for jeeps and armored cars. Well, I won't bore you with induction details, but to follow this story, you have to know something about the GCT, the General Classification Test. The GCT was an aptitude test given to everyone at induction. The test was nonverbal. We were asked to look at drawings and reason about them under a time constraint. For example, we had to count the number of cubes arranged in various shapes and just put down the number. For drawings of right and left-hand threaded screws shown in all possible orientations, we had to show their direction of motion when twisted one way or the other. There were analogies to be recognized, etc. So the GCT score, one number, allowed an officer to judge one's ability to observe carefully and to reason well and quickly. So, well, long before my enlistment, I was attracted by an ad in Popular Mechanics magazine offering to sell the GCT test. So I mailed a few bucks for the sample problems, and over some maybe 6 months, I did some serious cramming. And then at the downtown Chicago Induction Center, I aced the GCT. So of course, we were not given the test results. But a few months later, on a cool winter morning in California's Mojave Desert after my basic training was over, I was approached by A Troop's clerk, Corporal Red Johnson from Minnesota, and he began this dialogue. Sussman, do you know that you have the highest GCT in the squadron? Now, a squadron has 3 line troops and a headquarter troop, over 500 men. So I say, what's a GCT? I was playing it cool, you know. It's that test you took at the induction center. Your score was 184. Well, what was normal? Well, I asked. Well, that was still cool, you know. Well, he said normal is 100. The next highest score was 134. A lieutenant in C Troop. So I said, Red, what was your score? Now, a troop clerk was picked for being sharp, really sharp, because the troop clerk ran the whole troop. He had to see that everyone got what they needed. He said, I got 112. Very interesting, yes. Interesting, but forgotten during 5 more months of the desert heat, followed by a furlough home, followed by more training in East Texas, and then a convoy overseas to England, and training in England, and then D-Day, and then a month of combat, and forgotten by me, but not forgotten by Army records, no. Because on that rainy July day in Normandy, while I was dozing off in my foxhole, a call was passed down the hedgerow from foxhole to foxhole. Sussman, go see the sergeant. And a cloud of dirt in my face woke me up. Believe me, if you go without sleep long enough, you can fall asleep even with mortars dropping nearby. So I grabbed my rifle, and with my rain poncho and a helmet, I ducked to the end of a hedgerow. And sitting in his corner foxhole, Sergeant McDermott had a mean look on his face. He says, "Sussman, what did you do? The captain wants to see you." I didn't do nothing. The double negative was obligatory. Said, ducking my way past two more hedgerows to the rear, I heard my name, and looking around, I saw Captain Benj in a deep foxhole. He says, "Sussman, get down here, mortars are coming in." Well, it did seem to me it was quiet back there, but I quickly joined him. He says, "Sussman, what did you do? The colonel wants to see you." "I have no idea, sir," with a salute and no double negative. Said, "Well, Corporal Buck has a jeep to take you to Squadron. Look sharp." So another salute, and I double-timed to the roadway. And during a 3-minute wet and bumpy ride through quiet fields, Isaac Buck from South Dakota asked me what this was all about, and I told him I had no idea. It was the absolute truth. Well, Colonel Dunn's tent had a folding card table with a light bulb over it, and a telephone and some papers on it, and a small file drawer next to it. There was more to see, but my eyes were fixed on the colonel, seated on a folding chair at the table. He was a West Pointer, short, trim, and wry. He had a low but commanding voice and a confident look that always impressed us. He returned my salute with, "At ease, trooper." And then he asked the following questions with my replies. "Yeah. Your name is Marvin Sussman?" "Yes, sir." "Your rank is private?" "Yes, sir." "You are a rifleman?" "Yes, sir." "You serve in a line platoon?" "Yes, sir." "You have been in combat over 30 days?" "Yes, sir." "You are over 18? "Yes, sir." "You are under 21? "Yes, sir." "You have a high school diploma?" "Yes, sir." Then a minute of silence while he examined some papers. Then he said, "Trooper, you are the only man in the squadron who qualifies." "Sir?" I was puzzled. "Trooper, you are going to West Point for 4 years. They will make you an officer and a gentleman. You will leave immediately. Corporal Buck will get your duffel bag. Sign this." Now, all of that was said in a gravelly monotone, like reading a grocery list, while handing me a typed sheet of paper. I was probably standing there with my mouth open, stunned, silent, motionless. My mind was racing. That damn GCT. 4 years. And then an army career. Out of a foxhole into hell. This damn war was almost over. The Krauts were giving up. The Red Army was near Warsaw. With our capture of Saipan Island, our Air Force could destroy Japan. If I could stick this thing out for a few months, I could be home free. And Colonel Dunn wants my signature. Now. Moreover, I had enlisted for combat service because I wanted to accept a risk that I could not ask others to take for me. Now Colonel Dunn was taking away that risk. See, choosing a branch of service was the most important moral decision of my entire life, and probably the lives of every volunteer. We were choosing between, we could choose either safety or danger. And during most of 1942, it appeared that we could very well lose the war, in which case most of us would be dead, or we would wish that we were dead. Under those circumstances, we were choosing the amount of danger that we dared to face. All my friends were making their choices: Air Force, infantry, Marines. Nobody was mentioning the Coast Guard or the quartermaster, except as a joke. Now, was that male bravado? Yes, there was some of that, but there was also a real need, if we survived, to be able to look in the mirror without shame every morning for the rest of our lives. So going to West Point for 4 years, avoiding the risks, leaving it to others, did not seem right. And how could I sit in a classroom listening to a lecture while A troopers were lying in foxholes, listening to incoming death and destruction? How could I concentrate on facts, numbers, and words while remembering faces, names, and wounds? A troopers were not just friends. During more than 20 months, we ate almost 2,000 meals together and became close companions. And then a month of combat had turned companions into brothers. I was closer to a couple of those guys than I was to my own brother, 5 years younger than me. Leaving them for West Point did not seem right. Well, Colonel Dunn must have sensed my hesitation, because he explained further. The 7th Army Corps has a quota of 5 men with combat experience to be sent to West Point. And by God, one of them is coming out of my squadron. Now, an Army Corps has about 2,000 squadrons. So out of 400 squadrons, only one would get to send a cadet to West Point. Yes, sir! That was the only possible response to a commanding voice that was no longer low. Colonel Dunn's Irish eyes were not smiling. No matter how I got that high GCT score, I was at least intelligent enough not to argue with a colonel with his mind made up. So to read and sign the paper, I reached under my rain poncho into my shirt for my eyeglasses and fumbled them. You wear glasses, trooper? Yes, sir. Trooper, you may return to your unit. Yes, sir. Followed by a sharp salute, a snappy about face, and a hasty retreat. Today, West Point will take you with your eyeglasses, false teeth, and hearing aid, if not with artificial limbs and a pacemaker. But that was 1944. So, back to the foxhole in the 88s. I explained the trip to squadron headquarters as a need to straighten out some records. The truth would only have brought on a ribbing, well-deserved and never-ending. I could have saved a few dollars, a lot of time spent cramming for the GCT and all that day's turmoil. The thing is, I now have another counterfactual to mull over. What if I had not reached for my glasses? All I had to do was sign the damn thing. Probably on arrival, West Point would have accepted me with good enough eyes. How would that alter my life? I would probably get to play poker with future famous generals. I could become a famous general. Or I could be killed leading an infantry platoon in Korea, etc., etc. But that's all fantasy. The reality is that on that rainy July day, during that 3-minute wet and bumpy ride through quiet fields with Isaac Buck, going back to the foxhole in the 88s, I did feel relieved, if not exactly happy. But a few months later, soaking my butt in the Hurtgen forest or freezing it in the Bulge, there were moments, oh yes, there were moments, when I really missed being at West Point. on the Hudson. Thank you. Well, I thought you'd like to know what it felt like waiting for D-Day. See, now I entered the Army at mid-autumn 1942, as did the other recruits who joined A Troop of the 4th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. So until the landing on the French beach on D-Day, June 6th, 1940, we spent a good 20 months waiting for D-Day in England. Of course, we were kept busy training for 3 winter months, freezing in the Black Hills of South Dakota, expecting to fight in Norway. Then we spent 6 months in California's burning Mojave Desert, and 2 more months in East Texas, almost as hot, expecting to battle in North Africa. Then we had a 2-week furlough to say goodbye to our families before crossing the North Atlantic in late November 1943, expecting to invade England the next spring or on some unknown D-Day. But I hasten to add that we all enjoyed southern England during doing road reconnaissance, practicing in a mild winter. When not camping on the road, we lived in Quonset huts underneath the stands in Goodwood Park, a racing course. A Quonset hut is a half cylinder of corrugated sheet metal, about 10 feet high in the middle, and long enough to sleep a cavalry platoon, 30 men. You have to imagine a college locker room with 2 rows of double bunk beds instead of showers, which were outside with the latrines. It was inside was a radio and gambling with cards or dice. Now you multiply that Quonset hut by 100,000 similar huts all over the British Isles, and you have an idea of what it meant to wait for D-Day. When D-Day came, there was a huge sigh of relief. We all preferred to risk everything than spend one more day in a Quonset hut. Okay, the second story now. The only good reason to tell an unpleasant war story is that it illustrates something important, and that's the reason I tell this unpleasant war story. Late in July 1944, the 7th Army Corps broke out of Normandy. So no longer impeded by the easily defended hedgerows, our armored divisions could drive rapidly toward Germany. Eventually, the last week of August, when resistance became disorganized, the cavalry was summoned to lead the way to Germany. For a month, we had been following the infantry, screening their flanks, picking up German stragglers. Now, after making a wide circle east and north of Paris, approaching Château-Thierry on the Marne River, we were finally ordered to go ahead of the armor and infantry and seize an important bridge as soon as possible. My squad, augmented by 2 sergeants, was given the job. Racing against the sun, we were trying to get across the Marne before nightfall. When we reached that point of no resistance and open roads, we began our road reconnaissance. That consisted first of standing at one bend in the road, sighting carefully at the next road bend for an enemy ambush at the next road bend. The squad's 2 jeeps would leapfrog, one of the jeeps racing to the next road bend, while the other jeep and the armored car were aiming at a possible ambush at the far road bend. Each of the jeeps had a .30 caliber machine gun mounted on the hood to the right of the driver, and the driver and the gunner could peer over a cast iron shield mounted on the hood. A .50 caliber machine gun was mounted on a post in the rear of the jeep, and the M7 armored car had a 37 millimeter cannon that could fire rounds of white phosphorus. It also had a .30 caliber machine gun to the driver's right and a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a post in the turret. And a 3-second burst from all the guns in the squad would deliver over 100 bullets and maybe two rounds of phosphorus. So that's how you get out of trouble if you get in trouble. For one half of the road bends that my squad scouted, I sat to the right of the Jeep driver as he was shifting into second gear and picking up speed on the way to the far road bend where a possible ambush was lurking. My hands on the .30 caliber machine gun. Was I afraid? Yes, but confident that we had had a good look and resigned to whatever happened. The dominant emotion was excitement. With the wind in my face, there was a sense of power, even euphoria, like running with a football for a touchdown that looked sure. The simple fact is that war is the most fun that a young man can have, except for that part where people get hurt. So we learned real fear in the Hurtgen forest, in the Bulge, gradually, after too many close calls, as friends disappeared while we survived. When we got to Chateau Thierry, August 28th, 4 days after Paris was liberated, the mood in town was delirious. The Germans had left the city south of the bridge the day before, but they could still be defending the North Shore of the Marne. Our squad was the first Allied troops the people had seen. Liberation was all new for them, but old for us. During August, we could experience 2 or 3 liberations in one day. For the French, after 4 years of military occupation, rationing, Allied bombings, arrests, executions, liberation was a big deal. Happiness reigned in the streets. And that was our problem. With the sun setting, we were in a hurry to get to that bridge and grab it. Saving time meant saving lives. We honked, but the crowd wouldn't scatter. I had to walk in front, clearing the way. Finally, the crowd thinned and we could get into second gear. In a few minutes, the river and the bridge were in view. We parked the vehicles out of sight and walked cautiously to where we could observe the bridgehead on the other side of the river. As the summer days were getting shorter, the light was no longer good. Our field glasses found nothing, but that was not reassuring. The bridge had 2 auto lanes. The river was wide, about 100 meters. If there were Germans on the far shore, they were well hidden, possibly in any of the buildings. Too many possible targets to test. There was no way we could take the bridge unless it was unguarded, completely unguarded. If it was guarded, they had at least a squad with a machine gun. And we needed a platoon to attack a squad. Almost certainly they would have a platoon of 3 squads with an officer in command. On the other hand, if it was unguarded, we could defend it while waiting for the rest of A Troop to come. Now, Sergeant Edward Enger from Blue Earth, Minnesota, had an order to take the bridge if possible. It didn't take him long to decide. We would go. Sergeant Enger laid out the plan. As backup, the M7 armored car with Sergeant Richard McDermott and 3 men was set where its cannon could point at the far bridgehead, and its 2 machine guns would cover the shore on each side of the bridge. 2 jeeps, one following the other, would cross the bridge to the other side, and the armored car would join us if all was clear. The plan was to race across, making a difficult target. The first jeep's guns would cover the bridgehead and the shore to the left. The second jeep's guns would cover the shore to the right. At the first shot from the enemy, the gunners would return fire, all gunners. The drivers would continue forward for a few seconds to allow the jeep's 4 machine guns to spray the source of fire. Then they would slam on the brakes and skid the jeeps into reverse direction and race back. The hood-mounted .30 caliber guns would have to cease fire in that case, and the .50 caliber gunners would have to swing around facing the rear and keep firing all the way back. If we discovered the enemy only after reaching the far shore, we would either shoot our way in or shoot our way out, depending on what we found. Robert Novak from the south side of Chicago was driving the first Jeep. Sergeant Anger at his right manned the .30 caliber machine gun. Robert Whalen from Covington, Kentucky, across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, manned the .50 caliber machine gun. In the second Jeep, the driver was John Klakowski, also from Chicago's south side. From Chicago's west side, I was on his right on the .30 caliber machine gun. Oscar Howell from Greensboro, North Carolina, was standing up in the back, manning the .50 caliber machine gun. Far back from the bridge, Novak took off, and John Clark followed him a few seconds later. Novak moved into second gear before reaching the bridge, picked up speed, and was half of the way across when a machine gun opened fire from the other side. My Jeep was 1/3 of the way across. We saw the muzzle flash and tracers coming from slightly to the left of the bridgehead and well beyond the shoreline. All of our guns fired at once. I could hear the M7's cannon fire and saw a white cloud near the enemy position. After a few seconds, both Jeeps skidded into the reverse direction. I had to stop firing and started to sit on the hood to leave room for Oscar to turn around, turn the .50 caliber around. At that moment, I saw Whalen without his helmet, standing in the back of the first Jeep and falling out of the Jeep to his right onto the bridge. After the first Jeep reversed direction, Novak drove it to where Whalen was lying on his back. After Clark had reversed our Jeep, I was sitting on the hood, holding on to the .30 caliber gun for support, facing the rear. I could see Anger examining Whalen. Oscar kept firing the .50 caliber over my head, the only mobile weapon still active. The armored car was also firing all its guns. There appeared to be no more firing from the enemy. As I watched, Novak began to follow us back. When we got back to safety, Robert Whalen was alone, lying on the bridge. Parked behind the building, Anger explained that Bobby had at least one terrible head wound and at least two wounds in the chest. He was motionless and not bleeding. His heart had stopped. Robert Whalen was dead. We stood around in silence. I was the only one not smoking. After a few minutes, Anger wrote a message to Troop A headquarters for me to encode and tap out. The message said only that Whalen was killed in a failed attempt to seize the bridge and gave our location, but nothing else. Waiting for a reply, Anger broke the silence. I should have taken Bobby with us. We assured him that he made the right choice. A few seconds could have cost more lives. We would get Whalen's body in any case. I copied the reply to my message as it beeped in. Troop A headquarters would inform us when they had set up a bivouac just before the city. With no more to do until morning, we were about to open sea ration cans when a few civilians approached. One of them was a school teacher I had questioned earlier. The teacher invited us to a banquet in a close-by community hall. Food and drinks were being laid out on tables. Liberation was being celebrated after over 4 years of military occupation. The champagne was flowing and there were trays with slices of bread smeared with all kinds of stuff. It was what GIs called horses' duvers. The atmosphere was French conversation and laughter. On a radio, someone in Paris was describing the celebrations. When the teacher revealed that I spoke a decent French, some very happy people asked all the questions that I had been asked during each liberation. I barely responded, managing to keep my mouth full to avoid talking. I did not mention losing Whalen. Why throw cold water on their celebration? Finally, I left Novak, Clock, and Howell with a crowd practicing their English, and joined the two sergeants eating and drinking, surrounded by another crowd practicing their English. Gradually, we were eating less and drinking more. The champagne was doing its work in what was becoming a wake in the midst of a celebration. Between sips of champagne, Anger repeated that he should have taken Bobby off the bridge. Finally, Mac tired of hearing that and said, well, let's go get Bobby and bring him back. Anger's face lit up. He said, yes, let's go. This was crazy, contrary to the rules as well as to good sense. It could end badly. No matter. Somehow, it seemed like the right thing to do. Maybe it was the champagne. Okay, it was the champagne. We went out to our vehicles being guarded by the M7 armored crew, Schaefer, Mendel, and Melendez. And the radio had informed them that Troop A headquarters had set up a bivouac just before the city. Sergeant Enger drove there and brought back our medic, Geiger, and a stretcher. Four of us, the two sergeants, Geiger and myself, went in one jeep back toward the bridge, flying the Red Cross flag. There was now only moonlight. We parked the jeep far from the bridgehead. Geiger, with his Red Cross helmet and carrying the flag, led the way to the body. If there were Germans still on guard, they respected the flag. We lifted Bobby onto the stretcher and carried him back to the jeep. While Mac and I walked all the way back to the community hall, Anger and Geiger drove back to the headquarters bivouac. Anger left Bobby with Geiger at his first aid tent and rejoined us at the community hall. Taking turns at guard, we continued the wake with more horses, duvers, and champagne. When we had mourned enough and returned to the bivouac, it was well after midnight. So, who was Robert Whalen? He was, at that time, a typical American, like 100 million others. And he was also our brother in arms, pulling his weight, sharing our fate. If you could see Robert Whalen as I saw him before his death, standing in the jeep, rushing toward the enemy, the wind in his face, a weapon in his hands, spitting fire at the enemy, you would see what I saw, an American hero. And we could not leave him on the bridge where at dawn the crows would peck at his body. Ed Anger had to go and get him and carry him back for a proper burial. Damn the consequences. Well, what was motivating Sergeant Anger, you may ask? I did too. He seemed to be obsessed. Of course, I can only guess, but my best guess is that Ed Anger sensed the responsibility for the death of Robert Whalen. He had taken a chance with unknown odds and had guessed wrong, and Bobby's death was the result. Such decisions are made in combat as often as leaves fall in autumn. Every commander has such a burden, but some cases are different than others. It was probably easier for General Eisenhower to send 1 million men to danger on D-Day than for Sergeant Anger to risk one squad for a bridge. Different stakes, different bets to be made, and different attitudes on losing the bet. That's why soldiers quickly recognize and look up to good leaders like Ed Anger and are willing to follow them into the gates of hell. Eventually, Robert Whalen was buried at the American Cemetery in Epinal, France, east of Paris in the Lorraine region. Of the 10 members of the squad that day, only 6 went home. Of my Jeep's crew, I was the only one that went home. Howell and John Klukowski were killed in action later and buried in an American cemetery in Europe. Manuel Melendez was killed in action later and was returned to his family in Detroit, Michigan. May they all rest in peace. I want to say something about military cemeteries, about cemeteries. To prepare for war, a nation needs a number of citizens who will offer their lives to save the nation. To guarantee that number, the nation's culture must venerate those who die in combat. No matter how they died, they are viewed as heroes, almost saints. Their bodies are treated with honors, a military funeral, a beautiful gravesite, a sturdy memorial with name and rank and date of death. Assured of veneration, in the worst case, we hope that our nation's youth will offer their service, their lives in service. It has always been so. The climax of Homer's Iliad is exactly about the desecration of the body of the Trojan prince killed by Achilles, who takes the body to his tent, drags the body behind his chariot for further desecration. The Iliad's climax comes when the king of Troy comes to the tent to beg for his son's body. His tears move Achilles to repent, and both men embrace in tears. So what may well be our greatest work of literature is all about respect for the body of a fallen warrior. Sergeant Ed Enger, whether he knew it or not, was just following a very long tradition. During World War I, the enemy was buried for sanitary reasons without ceremony. In World War II, we often passed by the bodies of fallen Germans who had to be left by the retreating army. We moved too quickly to see what happened to our own dead. In effect, we, who saw our share of dead on both sides, saw no burial in Europe. The first military burial I experienced was that of my best childhood friend, Attila Nicolo, killed December 1944 in the Philippines. His parents requested that he be returned home for a proper Catholic burial. That took place more than 2 years after his death in the Queen of Heaven Cemetery in our western suburbs, after a mass at Our Lady of Sorrows on the west side. The neighborhood turned out. There were 6 boyhood friends as pallbearers, all war veterans. Nothing is more tragic than the burial of a young person, and there were so many. Now for the next story. Why was I able to translate the French language for Troop A of the 4th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron? Because in England, several months before D-Day, Sergeant McDermott ordered me and a few other A troopers to learn French. Our aptitude scores were high enough to bet that we could learn a useful amount of French. I was given a small piece of luggage that opened to reveal a portable phonograph record player, headphones, and a crank handle for winding up a 78 RPM motor. There was also a box of 15 records, each side containing one lesson, delivered by voices of professors at the Sorbonne University of Paris. 3 books included the texts of 30 lessons, a grammar, and a dictionary. Frankly, I fell in love with the French language. If I could make sounds like that, mademoiselles would swoon. The schedule provided for 2 hours of study in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon, to which I added 2 more evening hours. I almost finished the course. Unfortunately, sometime after D-Day, on meeting my first Frenchman, I was dismayed to find that he was not a Sorbonne professor, and that his rapid colloquial French was Greek to me. Nevertheless, my French was good enough to ask a farmer how recently he had seen any Germans. and also good enough to ask the farmer for Calvados, the local apple brandy, in trade for cigarettes. The quality of their brandy was about the same as American Applejack. They kept the good 30-year-old stuff hidden, but Applejack was good enough for my sergeant, Harvey Olson, who regarded Calvados as a necessity, unfortunately not provided by the U.S. Army. One of the first combat duties of the squadron was protecting the left flank of the 4th Infantry Division as it advanced from Utah Beach to the other side of the peninsula. We looked for trouble by poking around, starting sometimes at dawn. Sergeant Olson would typically form a foot patrol by pointing to individuals in the platoon while saying, you, and you too, Sussman. So it was not the Lord, but Sussman, who with his French vocabulary would provide Olson with Calvados. Whatever else happened on a patrol, we usually came back with a half-filled wine bottle. As much as I would rather avoid a dawn patrol, I really did like talking to Norman farmers while Olson was sipping a small glass. Rarely, as we crossed Normandy, did I manage to meet mademoiselles, who were probably kept hidden along with the 30-year-old Calvados. And the few that I did meet never swooned. One sunny morning, about halfway across the Normandy Peninsula, where the hilly land was near its highest altitude, we did find trouble. The date was about D+20, the end of June, 1944. We, a 4-man patrol led by Sergeant Olson, were walking westward through fallow meadows. With 1 million or more French prisoners of war working in Germany, only the best land was farmed. We were climbing up a steep hill with a wide, bushy crest. As we approached the crest of the hill, we spread out from left to right, crawling through the bushes to examine the landscape ahead of us. The first peak revealed an amazing sight. Ahead, the hill descended into an open field, a meadow fit for grazing. But instead of cows, we saw about 300 meters from us more than 50 German soldiers advancing toward us at a slow walk, spread out in one row from left to right, about 5 meters apart. They carried rifles across their chests, ready to be used. In the center of the line and about 10 meters in front of it, a commanding officer set the pace. What remained of a German infantry company was moving toward us, intending to climb up into our laps. Very soon we would have to move. To explain that sight, I have to explain something about tactics. When American infantry moves down a Normandy road, it proceeds in 2 columns, one on each side of the road, with lots of space between men to minimize casualties. Our air superiority eliminated the danger of strafing. Now, German infantry would do the same at night, but during daylight, that was not safe. If a Spitfire were to dive out of the clouds and strafe their column on a roadway, they would be hemmed in by the roadside hedgerows, unable to escape bullets or napalm. So during the day, they preferred to travel in open fields where they could scramble in any direction. By walking abreast, they were all a similar distance from any target before them and could concentrate their fire without hitting a friend. They had much more firepower than we had, but we did have one advantage. The sun was overhead, behind us. To see us hidden in the brush, they would have had to look directly into the sun. They could only guess at the source of our rifle fire. Of course, I saw no reason to fire. We were scouting for information and not to win the war. The captain was headed straight out of the Normandy Peninsula. Maybe he thought they could go all the way to Germany, but more likely he expected to end up in a POW camp, prisoner of war camp, where they could finally get a meal. It was fascinating to watch them getting nearer, but time was working against us. None of us spoke until the captain was less than 200 meters away. Then almost at once, three of us whispered, "Ole, we have to get out of here." Olson was silent for a few seconds, then he said, "Yes, but first I want to get that captain. Aim at his chest, but don't fire until you hear my shot." What an idea, an execution. All of us had sharpshooter medals, and all except me had been hunting since the age of 10. We were right at the hill crest, in a prone position, rifles poised to fire, and could drop back below the hill crest to safety in a few seconds after firing. We had to run back with a report in any case. Why not? As the captain started up the hill, it became obvious to us that Olson was going to wait until we could see the whites of his eyes. So we had time to think. Maybe too much time. Before this day, I had fired at enemy soldiers at a distance, but they were moving rapidly, so there was no time to aim carefully. We got off as many shots as possible, but the targets would drop out of sight when fired upon. We seldom knew how effective our shots were. So there I was, for the first time, really aiming at a human being, a certain kill. He appeared to be about 30, wore glasses, and was athletic enough to start up the hill without breaking stride. He probably graduated from university. He could easily be married, maybe with children. He could be thinking of them. Yet, within 1 minute, he would be dead. And I had other thoughts. When I was about 10 years old, 1933, I saw a marvelous movie, All Quiet on the Western Front. It was based upon a book describing the grim life of a German infantry soldier during several years of World War I. The author was wounded 5 times, so we know that the description is accurate. In the novel, the soldier, Paul Boehmer, had survived many artillery bombardments, gas attacks, and fierce hand-to-hand struggles with bayonets. In the novel's ending, very near the end of the war, on a quiet day with no combat, all quiet on the Western Front, Paul Boehmer was killed. The book does not describe the manner of death at all, but the movie ends with a portrayal. First, we are shown a bright day over a green field. A butterfly lands on a flower near the soldier who collected butterflies. While he reaches very slowly to capture the insect, the camera cuts to a French sniper taking aim with his telescopic sights. Then the camera shifts back to a close-up, showing only the soldier's hand, moving slowly toward the butterfly. As the hand moves, we see it suddenly jerk up. Then we see the hand drop slowly to the ground as the butterfly, the symbol of life, flies away. And we know that Paul Boehmer is dead. So you can see why the director got 2 Oscars. Walking out of the dark Balbin and Katz Central Park Theater into the bright daylight on Roosevelt Road on Chicago's west side, my memory of that moment as a 10-year-old is how much I hated that French sniper. Yes, the French were our ally and the Germans our enemy, but by the end of the movie, The audience sympathy was with the German soldier who only wanted to survive and go home. And the war was almost over. As the German officer climbed the hill, I remembered that French sniper. I was now that hated sniper. I was conflicted. If an enemy is charging toward you or shooting at you, you will fire at the enemy with a sense of fear or even panic. Emotionally, you know why you're pulling the trigger. But as a well-hidden sniper, you have no fear or panic. A sniper fires calmly at someone who is not an immediate threat to him. In this case, the Germans were probably hours away from a prison camp where they would be rendered harmless. This captain had gone through 5 years of war, and the war was almost over. If he got to the POW camp, he would eventually go home to his family. He could pick up the pieces, have a career, maybe do something good. He could be a Nazi, but 2/3 of the Germans voted against Hitler in 1933. And German army officers tried to assassinate Hitler. Everybody, good or evil, gets dragged into a war. So how can any individual be judged? Well, I must admit I was naive. I had read all the well-known German writers. I had a great respect for German culture, at the top in science, math, music, and literature. This was June 1944, before the discovery of the death camps and other atrocities that the German army had watched in silence, if not participating. I looked at Germans as any other people now caught in a trap. Such naivete did not last the war, but it lasted through Normandy. So here I was, about to kill Paul Boehmer. The only motivation for a sniper to kill is duty or hatred of the enemy, or both. Did I hate this Paul Boehmer enough to keep him out of a POW camp? Maybe, maybe not. Of course, his death was inevitable. I could easily miss him, and no one would know, and my conscience would be clear. On the one hand, if I killed him, it would be in cold blood. There is something in human nature that instinctively resists killing a fellow human being in cold blood. I would be killing him like Cain killed Abel. Did I waste my time reading Kant and Niebuhr? On the other hand, a German officer could not surrender unless he ran out of ammunition, and that was not the case. So there was no way that Paul Boehmer could be thought of as anything but a deadly enemy. In any case, I had been given an order, and I had a duty to obey. So where does that leave the philosophers? They knew nothing about the logic of war, no more than a 10-year-old. So I had to overcome instinct and aim well. The officer kept a steady pace uphill. I kept my sight on Paul Boehmer's chest, following his movements. Olsen waited until the captain was about 30 meters away, home plate to second base, slowing his pace as the hill became steeper. Olsen's shot rang into my ear. As I was squeezing the trigger, Paul Boehmer moved away, reacting to the hit, and stopped only on the ground. Then, within a couple of seconds, 4 more of our shots went off, and we scrambled back to safety behind and below the hill crest. Olsen shouted grenades as he pulled a pin and heaved one over the crest as far as he could. We all did the same as a flurry of bullets cracked the air well over our heads. Then we ran down the hill, trying to keep our balance. Back on the flat ground, we kept running until the hill was out of sight. That was my first well-aimed shot at a human being, and also the last shot, before which I had time to think about the inner life of my target. Just so you know, that's the worst way to shoot someone. That evening, I could not stop thinking about Harvey Olsen. Off duty in a bar, Olsen was usually rowdy and only too happy to get into a fight. I was afraid that he could get us into trouble. But while I had been amazed by the sight of the advancing enemy, thinking about the captain's life and my duties as his enemy, Harvey Olsen had only one thought: how to inflict the maximum damage upon the enemy at a minimum risk to his men. I was acting like a philosopher, and Harvey Olsen was a soldier, a commander capable of meeting his responsibilities. He had seen the enemy, planned an ambush, and carried it off with astounding success. He had killed a leader and maybe a few more, and had probably wounded a dozen of the enemy, and had forced as many as 24 more to help the wounded. He had effectively disabled the enemy with a minimum of ammunition and no friendly losses. It was a lesson for me. I was naive. I would have to learn soldiering and to learn fast. Fortunately, I had a great teacher. Harvey Olsen won several medals, survived the war, stayed in the Army, fought in Korea, went home, and passed away peacefully at the age of 82. You can Google Harvey Olsen for more information about him. Whatever my thoughts were that evening, Ole had only one regret: that the patrol had returned without a bottle of Calvados. Sergeant Harvey Olsen was absolutely right. Calvados was a necessity, unfortunately not provided by the U.S. Army. Thank you. During 20 months of training and 11 months of combat, 8 troopers changed from being strangers to being companions who shared bread, to being friends who shared burdens, to being brothers who shared life and death. And it is that brotherhood that explains the ability of soldiers to do their duty. And carry on. In your playbills, you will find a Presidential Unit Citation, a military award presented to the entire 4th Cavalry Squadron for its performance during the Battle of the Bulge, when our paratroopers were being surrounded at Bastogne. On the way to rescue the paratroopers, the Germans had fortified a ridge with artillery that could delay the rescue. The squadron was tasked with removing that artillery, whatever the cost. They succeeded in removing that artillery, but at a great cost. I want to read a short excerpt from that citation and comment on it. By 1400 hours, quote, by 1400 hours, all resistance in the town had ceased, but the troop commanders of all the troops directly committed had either been killed or seriously wounded, and 5 of the 9 platoon leaders of the reconnaissance troops evacuated. 25% of the enlisted personnel had also become casualties. Again, on the morning of the following day, the remainder of the squadron drove and fought its way to the top of the ridge to the southeast, held by vastly superior enemy forces and excellent defense. Almost completely exhausted from the heavy fighting of the previous day, the troops nevertheless attacked at a dead run over 200 yards of open ground uphill to the ridge. Only the gallantry and esprit de corps of the officers and men, above and beyond the call of duty, enabled the squadron to reorganize again and again after losing many troop commanders, platoon leaders, and other key personnel vital to the continued functioning of a tactical unit. You can read the complete citation in your playbill. The citation uses the words gallantry and supreme devotion to duty for that quality which we all know more simply as courage. That quality springs not only from patriotism, but also from that which the citation calls esprit de corps, French for team spirit, but which I know as brotherhood, which more than anything else explains the source of the courage displayed. If you can imagine yourself among your brothers when the go command is called, all your brothers on your right and on your left will go. And you will go with them because it is your duty to go. But also because in the past weeks and months, at the risk of their own lives, they saved yours more than once. And now they are going into danger. And they will need you. And so you will go with them out of gratitude and loyalty and the brotherly love that will drive you above and beyond the call of duty. And that brotherhood is the reason, the true reason, that when the go command is called, everyone will go, and everyone will do what must be done, whatever the cost. When soldiers swear to obey all orders without hesitation, they make a promise they intend to keep. Keeping their promise and paying the price of freedom, 37 of my A-Troop brothers, out of 140 men at full strength, were killed in action. Their names are in the playbill. Unnamed here are my other A-Troop brothers, who also kept their promise and paid the price of freedom, suffering more than 100 wounds, far too often severe and permanent. So now you know how those promises were kept. To give meaning and value to their sacrifice and to ensure that these honored dead shall not have died in vain, please do whatever you can to make our leaders see the use of armed force as the very last resort. I thank you. Okay. Thank you very much.